Mark had spent years searching for the perfect home, a place where he could finally escape the chaos of city life and wake up to the peaceful sound of waves crashing against the shore. When he finally found it, a charming two-story beachfront house with a wraparound porch and large windows overlooking the ocean, he thought he had struck gold. The best part? It was legally separate from the homeowner association that governed the rest of the neighborhood. The previous owner, an elderly man named Richard Callahan, had lived there for over 30 years and assured Mark that the house was never part of the association and never would be. Decades ago, when the community was first developed, the original landowner had refused to sign the homeowner association agreement, ensuring that his property remained independent. Over the years, the homeowner association had made multiple attempts to absorb the house into their jurisdiction, but each time they failed. Mark saw this as a huge advantage. He would get all the benefits of living in a well-maintained neighborhood without any of the ridiculous restrictions or fees. Excited, he finalized the purchase, moved in, and started making plans to renovate. From the very first day, he could sense the tension. His new neighbors weren't exactly welcoming. As he unloaded boxes, he noticed people watching him from behind curtains or standing on their porches, whispering amongst themselves. When he waved at a couple across the street, they exchanged a glance before turning their backs and walking inside. The most obvious display of hostility came from a woman in an oversized sun hat and large sunglasses, who stood at the edge of his driveway, arms crossed, staring at him like he had personally offended her. Mark shrugged it off. Maybe they just weren't used to newcomers, or maybe they were just snobs who didn't like the idea of someone new disrupting their perfect little world. Either way, he didn't care. This was his house, and he wasn't going anywhere. It only took 2 days for the first notice to arrive. A crisp white envelope with a gold embossed logo was wedged into his front door. At first, he thought it was some kind of welcome letter, maybe an introduction to the neighborhood. Instead, it was a formal violation notice from the Coastal Ridge Homeowners Association, informing him that his property was not in compliance with community aesthetic standards. According to the letter, his house's exterior color was inconsistent with the approved neutral palette and needed to be repainted within 30 days. Additionally, his landscaping was deemed overgrown and neglected, and he was expected to submit an exterior modification request to bring his home up to standard. If he failed to comply, the letter warned fines would be imposed. Mark actually laughed out loud. He hadn't even unpacked yet, let alone repainted the house. And the landscaping? It looked fine to him. If anything, the yard had a bit of character compared to the perfectly manicured, sterile-looking lawns of his neighbors. But what made him laugh the most was the fact that the homeowner association had absolutely no authority over his property. His home wasn't part of the association, and they had no legal right to enforce their rules on him. He decided to ignore the letter, assuming it was just an automated mistake, but the letters kept coming, each one more aggressive than the last. One claimed that his mailbox didn't meet homeowner association regulations, despite looking exactly like half the mailboxes in the neighborhood. Another accused him of unauthorized modifications, even though he hadn't made any changes yet. The final letter came with an outright threat. Failure to comply would result in escalating fines and potential legal action. That's when Mark realized this wasn't just an error. It was a deliberate, targeted attack. A few days later, he finally met Donna Whitmore, the woman in the sun hat. She introduced herself as the president of the Coastal Ridge Homeowner Association, and from the moment she opened her mouth, Mark knew exactly what kind of person she was. She spoke with the kind of practiced politeness that was dripping with condescension, the kind that barely masked her obvious disdain. She made it clear that she wasn't thrilled about his presence in her community. When Mark pointed out that his house was legally separate from the homeowner association and that their rules didn't apply to him, her expression barely flickered, but he could see the irritation in her eyes. "We'll see about that," she said before turning on her heel and walking away. That's when things started to get worse. First, the road maintenance service conveniently forgot to plow or repair the street leading to his house, even after he called multiple times. Then, his trash pickup mysteriously stopped while everyone else's continued as usual. The biggest issue came a week later when he woke up one morning to find that his water had been shut off. When he called the utility company, they claimed there was a billing issue. Mark knew that was a lie. He had set up automatic payments. He spent hours on the phone until someone finally admitted, off the record, that there had been external pressure from the community board to review his account. In other words, Donna and her minions had pulled some strings to make his life difficult. That was the final straw. Mark had been willing to ignore the passive-aggressive letters and the cold stares, but now they were messing with his basic utilities. He wasn't just going to sit back and take it. He started doing research, digging through the homeowner association's history, looking for any dirt he could find. And what he uncovered was worse than he expected. The homeowner association had a long history of shady dealings, unlawful fines, property seizures, and lawsuits against homeowners who dared to push back against their authority. More importantly, he found evidence that the board had been trying for years to claim his property as part of their jurisdiction, but had repeatedly failed due to legal barriers. They weren't just harassing him out of spite. They wanted his house. Determined to fight back, Mark installed security cameras around his property to document any further harassment. He started keeping detailed records of every interaction, every letter, every instance of service disruption. Then he hired a lawyer, not just any lawyer, but someone who specialized in homeowner association disputes. When he showed his lawyer the documents proving that his home was legally exempt from homeowner association control, the lawyer immediately saw an opportunity for a countersuit. "They have no case," he said, "but we can make this very, very expensive for them." Mark wasn't just going to defend himself. He was going on the offensive. He wasn't some pushover they could bully into submission. If they wanted a war, they were going to get one. Mark wasted no time after realizing that the homeowner association was targeting him. The notices, the service disruptions, the sudden hostility from neighbors. It was all part of a deliberate strategy to pressure him into submission. But unlike the other homeowners who had caved under the weight of endless fines and harassment, he had something they didn't: legal proof that the homeowner association had no authority over his property. That alone should have been enough to shut them down. But Mark knew that people like Donna Whitmore didn't operate within the bounds of logic or legality. They operated through control, intimidation, and manipulation. If they couldn't win through the law, they would try to win through persistence, wearing him down until he either surrendered or moved away. Unfortunately for them, Mark had no intention of doing either. He expected their next move to be another barrage of fines, or perhaps an attempt to get the city involved under some bogus zoning violation. But instead, they went straight for the nuclear option, a full-fledged lawsuit against him. He found out when a uniformed process server knocked on his door early one morning, handing him an official envelope with the homeowner association's logo printed at the top. Mark opened on the spot, flipping through the neatly typed pages filled with legal jargon, his anger growing with every sentence. The Coastal Ridge Homeowners Association was suing him for violating community standards, reducing property values, and obstructing the ocean view for other homeowners. It was pure insanity. The claim about violating community standards was laughable, considering his house was not part of the community's governance. But the part about reducing property values and obstructing views was an even bigger stretch. His home had been there for decades, long before most of the other houses in the neighborhood were even built. The only thing that had changed was that now it had an owner who wasn't willing to bow down to the homeowner association's authority. His lawyer, a no-nonsense man named Daniel Carter, went over the lawsuit with him later that day. "They're desperate," Daniel said, flipping through the pages. "They have no legal grounds to enforce any of this, but they're hoping you either don't fight back or that you'll settle just to avoid the headache." Mark crossed his arms, glared at the paperwork. "Not happening." Daniel smirked. "Good, because this is actually going to be a lot of fun." That was the thing about homeowner association disputes. They were messy, drawn out, and often frustrating. But when you had the law on your side, they could also be incredibly satisfying. Daniel had spent years tearing apart corrupt homeowner association boards, and he could already see the cracks forming in their case. "They're trying to argue that your house is an eyesore that's bringing down the neighborhood's aesthetic," he explained. "That's subjective nonsense. which won't hold up in court. Then they're claiming your renovations are causing disruptions. Also nonsense, considering you haven't even started construction yet. But the kicker is this ocean view claim. Mark exhaled sharply. Yeah, explain that one to me. They're arguing that because your house is on elevated land, it blocks the panoramic ocean view that some of the homeowners previously had access to. They're going to claim that this reduces the value of those properties and that, as a result, you should be financially liable for their loss. Mark stared at him in disbelief. That's ridiculous. My house has been here forever. It didn't just pop up overnight. Daniel chuckled. Of course, it's ridiculous. But they're counting on a judge not wanting to wade through the details and just ruling in their favor to make the problem go away. Mark shook his head. So what do we do? Daniel leaned back in his chair, smirking. We hit them where it hurts. The first step was filing a motion to dismiss, which would force the homeowner association to provide actual legal justification for their claims before the case even went to trial. Daniel also drafted a countersuit for harassment, defamation, and illegal interference with property rights. If the homeowner association thought they could just bully Mark into submission, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. Mark wanted to play defense, but he also wanted to go on the offensive. He spent the next week collecting evidence of every shady thing the homeowner association had done since the day he moved in. The service disruptions, the harassment, the retaliatory fines. He even installed high-definition security cameras around his house to catch anyone from the homeowner association trespassing or vandalizing his property. And it turned out that was a very good decision. 3 days later, he caught Donna Whitmore herself standing at the edge of his lawn, pointing at his house while talking to another homeowner association board member. The security footage showed them measuring something with a tape measure, shaking their heads, and taking photos. Daniel laughed when Mark showed him the footage. They're trying to fabricate evidence against you, he said. They want to argue that you've made some kind of unauthorized modification that justifies their interference. Can they? Mark asked. Nope, not unless you actually make a change, which you haven't. But they don't know that. That night, Mark received another letter from the homeowner association, this time stating that his fence was encroaching on community property. The claim was completely false, and Mark had the original property survey to prove it. But it was yet another tactic, another attempt to make his life difficult, hoping he'd eventually get tired and just sell the house. Except Mark wasn't like the other homeowners they had pushed around. He started gathering intel on the homeowner association itself, talking to other homeowners who had bad experiences with the board. At first, people were hesitant. No one wanted to go against the homeowner association out of fear of retaliation. But after Mark showed them that he was actually fighting back, some of them started coming forward. He discovered that Donna Whitmore had been the homeowner. Association president had been in power for over 15 years, and under her leadership, dozens of homeowners have been fined into oblivion or forced to sell their homes over fabricated violations. Some of them had even sued, but the homeowner association had deep pockets and high-powered lawyers, and most cases either settled or dragged on so long that the homeowners gave up. But Mark was different. He had the legal upper hand, and unlike the others, he wasn't afraid to take this all the way. The final nail in the coffin came when Mark's security cameras caught one of the homeowner association board members attempting to tamper with his fence in the middle of the night. The footage was clear, a man with a clipboard and a measuring tape trying to make it look like Mark had moved the fence beyond the property line. Mark sent the footage directly to Daniel, and that's when Daniel smiled. This, he said, is the beginning of the end for them. Now, it wasn't just a civil case. Now, there was evidence of criminal activity, and Mark knew without a shadow of a doubt that he was going to win. Mark knew that the homeowner association was relentless, but he hadn't expected them to escalate their tactics so quickly. The lawsuit had been filed, his countersuit was in motion, and his lawyer, Daniel Carter, was building a solid case against them. But the homeowner association wasn't going to wait for the courts to decide their fate. Instead, they launched a full-scale war of harassment, one that went beyond passive-aggressive notices and into the realm of outright intimidation. Mark had expected more legal maneuvers, perhaps another attempt to levy fake fines or fabricate additional violations. But what happened next was far worse. It started with a mysterious complaint filed with the city's zoning department. Mark received an official notice stating that an anonymous report had been submitted, claiming that his property was in violation of local zoning laws due to unauthorized modifications. This was particularly amusing to Mark because he hadn't modified anything yet. His home renovations were still in the planning phase. He had applied for no permits, changed no structures, and had barely even touched the landscaping beyond routine maintenance. It was clear that the homeowner association had manufactured the complaint, hoping that city officials would become an additional tool in their campaign against him. Mark immediately called Daniel, who wasn't surprised in the least. "This is a classic homeowner association move," Daniel said. "They're trying to use municipal resources against you, knowing that bureaucratic red tape can be a nightmare to untangle. If they can't find you directly, they'll get the city to do it for them." Mark wasn't about to let that happen. He gathered all the original property records, proving that no modifications had been made, and scheduled a meeting with the zoning inspector. When the inspector arrived, he walked through the property, clipboard in hand, and looked increasingly annoyed as he found nothing wrong. "I don't know why this was even reported," he muttered. "Everything looks fine to me." Mark pressed him for details on who had made the complaint, but the inspector refused to answer. "Anonymous reports are confidential," he said. "But between you and me, it's obvious someone is wasting my time." The complaint was dismissed, but Mark knew the homeowner association wasn't going to stop there. Sure enough, 2 days later, he woke up to find that his driveway had been blocked. Someone had left a pile of gravel and construction cones at the entrance, preventing his car from leaving the property. Mark immediately checked his security cameras, and, just as he expected, the footage showed a truck from a local construction company dumping the gravel in the dead of night. Even better, the driver was wearing a Coastal Ridge Homeowner Association vest. Mark didn't even bother calling them this time. He called the police. When the officers arrived, he showed them the footage, which clearly displayed the license plate number of the truck. The police ran the plates, and within an hour, they had tracked the vehicle back to a contractor that regularly worked with the homeowner association. The officers promised to investigate, but Mark could tell they weren't taking it seriously. "It's probably just a misunderstanding," one of them said. "Might be a delivery to the wrong address." Mark could tell that they didn't want to get involved in a civil dispute. He had no choice but to pay a private removal company to clear the driveway himself, but he made sure to save all the footage as evidence. That night, Daniel called him with an update. "I have something interesting for you," he said. "I did some digging into the homeowner association's history, and guess what I found? This isn't the first time they've been sued." He explained that over the past decade, Coastal Ridge Homeowner Association had been involved in multiple lawsuits, several of which never made it to court because they settled quietly. In one case, a homeowner had been wrongfully evicted from their home over unpaid fines that were later proven to be fraudulent. In another case, an elderly couple had been forced to sell their house after the homeowner association buried them in debt with fabricated violation fees. "The pattern is clear," Daniel said. "They target people who they think won't fight back. They pressure them into leaving, then use the empty property as leverage to drive up surrounding home values. I guarantee you that they have a plan for your house, too." Mark clenched his jaw. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. Daniel chuckled. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say." The harassment continued over the next several days. First, Mark received bogus noise complaints filed against him, even though he barely made any noise beyond the occasional music while working in the yard. Then, his mail stopped arriving. When he checked with the post office, they informed him that someone had submitted a change of address request on his behalf. Mark was furious. Someone from the homeowner association had literally rerouted his mail in an attempt to inconvenience him. He had to go through an entire verification process to undo the change, wasting more of his time. But the worst came when he returned home one evening to find that his power had been shut off. At first, he thought it was a standard outage, but when he checked the utility company's website, there was no reported service interruption in the area. When he called customer support, he got the answer he had been dreading. His service had been disconnected due to non-payment. Mark knew for a fact that he had paid his bill. In fact, his account was on autopay. He demanded to know what was going on, and after speaking with multiple representatives, he finally got to someone who let slip that a fraudulent request for disconnection had been submitted using his personal details. Mark was beyond livid. The homeowner association had now committed an actual crime. Tampering with someone's utilities was illegal, and he had every intention of holding them accountable. He called Daniel and told him everything. "Good," Daniel said. "This is exactly what we needed." Mark raised an eyebrow. "What are you talking about?" "Before, we only had evidence of harassment and property interference. But now, we have proof that they've committed identity fraud and tampered with your essential services. That's a crime, and not just a civil one. This could bring criminal charges against the homeowner association board members involved." Daniel wasted no time filing additional motions in court, expanding the countersuit to include fraud, identity theft, and illegal disruption of essential utilities. He also reported the homeowner association to the state's attorney general for an investigation into their practices. The final move came when Mark leaked the story to the press. He contacted a local journalist who had previously covered homeowner association abuse cases and provided them with all the evidence: the security footage of the gravel dumping, the fraudulent mail rerouting, and the illegal power shutoff. Within 24 hours, a news article was published with the headline, "Local Homeowner Association Faces Fraud Allegations After Allegedly Tampering with Homeowners' Utilities." The article spread like wildfire. Homeowners in the area who had been too afraid to speak out before finally started coming forward. More stories of harassment, fabricated violations, and illegal property seizures surfaced, painting a picture of a homeowner association that had been abusing its power for years. Donna Whitmore, once so confident in her authority, suddenly refused to comment. The homeowner association's lawyer tried to issue a generic statement claiming that they were committed to maintaining a high standard for the community, but the damage had been done. Mark could feel the shift. For the first time, the homeowner association was on the defensive, and he wasn't going to stop until they paid for everything they had done. Mark knew the homeowner association was feeling the pressure, but he also knew people like Donna Whitmore and her board weren't the type to go down without a fight. The lawsuit, the countersuit, the media coverage, it had all chipped away at their power, exposing them for the corrupt tyrants they were. But they weren't about to admit defeat. If anything, they were growing more desperate, and desperate people made reckless mistakes. It started subtly. The same neighbors who had ignored him or glared at him with hostility were suddenly more interested in making small talk. They weren't exactly friendly, but their tone had shifted. At first, he thought maybe the media coverage had changed their perception, made them realize that he wasn't the villain the homeowner association had painted him as. But then he started noticing a pattern. The conversations weren't casual at all. They were all asking the same things. How strong was his case? Was he planning to settle? Had he thought about selling and just leaving to avoid all the stress? It didn't take long for him to realize that these weren't concerned neighbors. They were informants. The homeowner association was using them to fish for information, trying to figure out if he was breaking, if the pressure was getting to him. He gave them nothing. If anything, it only steeled his resolve. Then came the mysterious offer. One morning, he found a handwritten note in his mailbox. No signature, no official letterhead, just a single sheet of paper with a vague yet unmistakable message. "Mr. Reynolds, there is an opportunity to resolve this issue quietly. A generous offer could be made if you are willing to sell." Mark read it twice, his grip tightening. So this was their game now. They had tried harassment, legal threats, even outright fraud to force him out, and none of it had worked. Now, they were trying to buy him out, to make this problem disappear before it got any worse for them. He had no doubt that if he responded, he'd get some ridiculously high offer for the property, something well above market value, just to get him to leave. But there was no number they could put on that check that would make him back down. This wasn't about money. This was about the principle of it all. The homeowner association had been terrorizing homeowners for years, driving people out, forcing them to comply with illegal fines, and getting away with it because no one had ever stood up to them. If he left now, it would prove them right, that they could bully and manipulate their way into getting whatever they wanted. He wasn't about to let that happen. He scanned the note for his records. Then, he burned it in his backyard fire pit. That must have been the moment they realized money wouldn't work, because the intimidation started almost immediately. A few days later, he received an email from an unknown sender. The subject line read, "Think carefully about your next move." Attached was a single image, a grainy photo of his house, taken from inside a car, as if someone had been sitting outside watching him. Mark immediately forwarded it to Daniel, who called him within minutes. "This is textbook intimidation," his lawyer said. "They're trying to scare you into dropping the case." Mark exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. He had dealt with a lot in the past few months: bogus fines, illegal service shutoffs, trespassing. But this was different. This wasn't about making his life inconvenient. This was a direct message. "We're watching you." Daniel didn't hesitate. "This isn't just a civil matter anymore," he said. "We can file a formal police report for harassment and stalking." Mark agreed without hesitation, going down to the police station that afternoon to submit the email along with all the other security footage he had collected of homeowner association board members trespassing on his property. The officer who took his report was more serious than the last one he had spoken to. "This crosses a line," he said after reviewing the evidence. "We'll open an investigation." That night, Mark installed even more security cameras, covering every possible angle of his property. He wasn't about to be caught off guard. The next escalation didn't come from the homeowner association directly, but from the city. One morning, he woke up to find a bright orange notice taped to his front door. "Order for immediate inspection," an official demand from the city's zoning department. The letter claimed that an anonymous complaint had been filed alleging that his property was in violation of multiple safety and zoning regulations. The city security man warned the public trespassers, a band of men with guns, were about to unleash an attack. Mark nearly laughed. They were trying the same stunt again. The last time they tried to use city zoning against him, the inspector had found nothing wrong. This time wouldn't be any different. He called Daniel, who sighed. "They must have someone on the inside at zoning enforcement. They're pulling strings to have your property flagged." Mark didn't wait. He called the zoning office himself and scheduled the inspection for that very day. When the inspector arrived, he seemed annoyed, like he already knew this was a waste of time. He walked the property, checked a few things, then shook his head. "There's nothing wrong here," he muttered, scribbling something on his clipboard. Mark folded his arms. "So what exactly prompted this inspection?" The inspector hesitated before answering. "There was a complaint." Mark stared. The inspector didn't confirm or deny it, but his silence was answer enough. By the end of the visit, he had found no violations, no unsafe structures, no reason for any further action. Another failed attempt from the homeowner association. But Mark wasn't playing defense anymore. He had everything he needed to go on the attack. Over the past few months, Daniel had been gathering testimony from other homeowners in the community, people who had been bullied into selling their homes, people who had been hit with illegal fines, people who had been too scared to fight back. Now, thanks to the trespassing footage, the harassment emails, the fraudulent service shutoffs, and the attempted intimidation, they had enough to bring real consequences to the homeowner association. The first major breakthrough came when Daniel filed formal criminal complaints against specific homeowner association board members, including Donna Whitmore. This wasn't just a civil lawsuit anymore. Now, there was an active criminal investigation. And suddenly, the people who had been so confident, so untouchable, were starting to panic. The harassment stopped almost overnight. No more letters. No more fake fines. No more staged complaints. The neighbors who had once seemed ready to tear him apart now avoided eye contact altogether. And then came the biggest sign of all. An emergency homeowner association meeting was called. Mark didn't attend, but he didn't have to. The next morning, he received a text from one of the homeowners who had secretly been supporting him from the start. "Donna resigned last night. The board is in chaos. They're talking about settling the lawsuit." Mark let out a slow breath, a smile creeping across his face. The homeowner association had lost control, and he wasn't stopping until every last one of them paid for what they had done. Mark had spent months fighting the homeowner association, enduring harassment, threats, legal battles, and even outright criminal behavior. But now he could feel the shift. The tides had turned. And for the first time since moving into his home, he wasn't the one on the defensive. The resignation of Donna Whitmore sent shock waves through the community. She had ruled the homeowner association for 15 years, operating with an iron grip, bullying homeowners, manipulating the rules, and turning the association into a profit-driven dictatorship. Now, with a criminal investigation looming over her, an ongoing lawsuit that threatened to expose years of corruption, she had done the only thing she could. She ran. But Donna's resignation wasn't the end. If anything, it was just the beginning. Without her leadership, the homeowner association board had descended into chaos. The remaining members were scrambling, arguing over damage control, trying to salvage what little authority they had left. The pressure was mounting. Homeowners who had once feared retaliation started speaking out, sharing their own stories of intimidation, unfair fines, and fraudulent legal threats. Some had been forced to sell their homes. Others had been pressured into paying thousands of dollars in bogus penalties just to be left alone. Now that they saw the homeowner association was vulnerable, they weren't afraid anymore. It wasn't long before Daniel, Mark's lawyer, received an email from the homeowner association's legal team. The board was ready to negotiate. They wanted to settle. Mark read the email twice, feeling a mix of satisfaction and rage. After everything they had done, they thought they could just throw money at him and make it all disappear. Daniel smirked. When Mark showed him a message, Daniel smirked. They're terrified, he said. They know that if this goes to trial, everything comes out, the fraud, the harassment, the abuse of power. This lawsuit won't just cost them money. It could get some of them arrested. Mark leaned back in his chair, considering his options. Settling would mean guaranteed compensation, but it would also mean giving them an easy way out. He didn't want just a payout. He wanted to destroy them. What if I don't settle? He asked. Daniel shrugged. Then we go to trial. And we win. Mark exhaled slowly. The thought of dragging the homeowner association through court was tempting, but he knew that some victories were bigger than a courtroom decision. He didn't just want to win for himself. He wanted to make sure no other homeowner in the neighborhood had to go through the same hell he had endured. And that meant more than just money. So he responded with his own terms. First, the homeowner association had to drop the lawsuit against him immediately and publicly admit that they had no legal authority over his property. Second, they had to refund every homeowner who had been unlawfully fined over the past 10 years and issue a public apology. Third, they had to implement mandatory oversight, an independent audit of the homeowner association's financials and legal dealings to prevent corruption from happening again. And finally, the entire board had to resign. Every single one of them. Daniel's jaw dropped when he read the list. You do realize they're going to fight this, right? Let them, Mark said. I have nothing to lose. For days, the homeowner association's lawyers tried to negotiate, offering more money, trying to remove certain conditions, pleading for leniency. But Mark refused to budge. He had the upper hand, and he wasn't going to let them slither away with a slap on the wrist. He ignored their counteroffers, their increasingly desperate attempts to make the problem disappear. The longer they stalled, the worse things got for them. The media coverage wasn't going away. More homeowners were coming forward with lawsuits of their own. The criminal investigation into Donna Whitmore and the other board members was expanding, with fraud charges becoming a real possibility. The city had even stepped in to review the homeowner association's legal authority, and there were rumors that their charter might be revoked entirely. The homeowner association had become a national embarrassment, a cautionary tale about what happens when power goes unchecked. Then, 3 weeks after Mark had sent his final demands, Daniel received a single email from the homeowner association's attorneys. They agreed to everything. Mark read the email in stunned silence. He had won. It took another week to finalize everything, but in the end, the result was undeniable. The lawsuit against Mark was officially dropped. The homeowner association sent public letters to every homeowner stating that Mark's property was, and had always been, outside of their jurisdiction. They issued refunds to dozens of homeowners who had been unlawfully fined over the years. The financial audit was scheduled, and a new policy was put in place that prevented any homeowner association member from serving more than 2 terms, eliminating the possibility of another long-term dictatorship. And most importantly, the entire board resigned. The final meeting of the Coastal Ridge Homeowners Association was a train wreck. Mark didn't attend, but he heard about it from a neighbor. It was chaotic, filled with angry homeowners shouting accusations and finger-pointing. Without Donna to keep them in line, the remaining board members turned on each other, blaming one another for how everything had fallen apart. The new financial audit exposed years of shady transactions, including embezzlement where homeowner association funds had been used for personal expenses, fancy dinners, vacations, and even a secret slush fund meant to deal with problematic homeowners like Mark. By the time the meeting ended, the homeowner association was dead. The entire system collapsed under its own corruption. A new homeowner-led committee was created to oversee neighborhood issues, but they had no power to fine people, issue legal threats, or enforce arbitrary rules. The dictatorship was gone, and just like that, the battle was over. On the night the resignations were made official, Mark sat on his porch, a beer in hand, watching the sun set over the ocean. The same view the homeowner association had claimed he was ruining, the same view they had tried to take from him. He thought about everything they had put him through, the harassment, the legal battles, the intimidation, the threats. They had tried everything to break him. And yet, he was still here. Not only had he won, but he had changed the neighborhood forever. No one would ever be bullied by the homeowner association again. No one would ever be scammed into fake violations, threatened with lawsuits, or forced out of their own home by a corrupt board. The house was his. The fight was over. And as he sat there, listening to the waves roll in, he smiled. Because in the end, he hadn't just beaten the homeowner association. He had destroyed them.